The outside air temperature was 7 degrees below zero. It was the night of November 24, 1971, and a man known only as Dan Cooper was standing alone on the lowered aft stairs of a Boeing 727, staring into a pitch-black storm over the Pacific Northwest. The wind chill was nearly 50 below zero. He had $200,000 strapped to his body, a military-grade parachute on his back, and absolutely no intention of ever landing the plane. At approximately 8:13 p.m., the crew in the sealed cockpit felt a sudden oscillation, a distinct pressure bump in their ears. The captain asked over the intercom, "Is everything okay back there?" There was no answer. The weight on the stairs was gone. For more than 50 years, the FBI, forensic scientists, and thousands of amateur sleuths have been trying to answer one question. Did he walk out of those woods, or is he still buried beneath them? This is the only unsolved case of air piracy in commercial aviation history, and the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. We are not just looking at a heist. We are looking at a perfect storm of 1970s lax security, incredibly specific aeronautical knowledge, and a disappearance so complete it feels almost supernatural. Over the next 40 minutes, we are going to reconstruct the timeline minute by minute, examine the microscopic particles found on his tie that completely changed the profile of the suspect, and look at the copycat who might have actually been the original. Stick around until the end, because we're going to discuss the strange anomaly of the buried money found 9 years later, a discovery that physically shouldn't exist if the accepted flight path is correct. It started on a Wednesday afternoon, the day before Thanksgiving, at Portland International Airport. The date was November 24, 1971. The airport was busy with holiday travelers, a chaotic scene that provided the perfect cover for a man who wanted to be invisible. He approached the Northwest Orient Airlines flight counter. Witnesses later described him as a man in his mid-40s, between 5'10" and 6 feet tall. He was wearing a dark suit, a perfectly pressed white shirt, a black raincoat, and a black clip-on tie held in place by a mother-of-pearl tie clip. He carried a dark attaché case. There was nothing remarkable about him. He looked like an executive, perhaps an engineer or a salesman heading home for the holiday. He bought a one-way ticket to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport for $20. He gave his name as Dan Cooper. It is important to pause here and contextualize the era for those of us used to modern travel. In 1971, airport security, as we know it, did not exist. There were no metal detectors, no X-ray machines for carry-on luggage, and passengers were not required to show identification. You simply bought a ticket and walked onto the plane. It was known as the golden age of hijacking, although usually, hijackers wanted to be flown to Cuba for political reasons. Extortion for cash was almost unheard of. Dan Cooper boarded Flight 305, a Boeing 727-100, and took seat 18C in the rear of the cabin. He ordered a bourbon and soda. He lit a cigarette. He waited. Shortly after takeoff, at roughly 3 p.m., Cooper handed a folded note to Florence Schaffner, the 23-year-old flight attendant seated nearest to him in the jump seat. Schaffner didn't look at it immediately. She was used to lonely businessmen slipping her phone numbers or hotel room keys. She just dropped the note into her purse and ignored him. This is a critical moment in the timeline because it shows Cooper's patience. He didn't get angry. He didn't yell. He simply leaned toward her and whispered, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Schaffner retrieved the note. The exact wording has been lost to history because Cooper later reclaimed the note, but Schaffner recalled it was printed in neat, all-capital letters with a felt-tip pen. It said something to the effect of, "I have a bomb in my briefcase. I will use it if necessary. I want you to sit next to me. You are being hijacked." Even then, Schaffner was skeptical. She sat down next to him and asked to see the bomb. Cooper calmly opened the attaché case. Inside, she saw 4 red cylinders clamped together, a battery, and a tangle of wires. He wasn't bluffing. Cooper then dictated his demands. He wanted $200,000 in negotiable American currency, meaning used bills with random serial numbers, not sequential ones. He wanted 4 parachutes, specifically 2 main back chutes and 2 reserve chest chutes. And he wanted a fuel truck standing by in Seattle to refuel the plane immediately upon landing. The demand for 4 parachutes is one of the most brilliant tactical moves in criminal history. If he had asked for just 1, the FBI might have given him a sabotage rig, a dummy chute that wouldn't open. But by asking for 4, he forced the authorities to assume he might be taking a hostage with him, perhaps Florence Schaffner or another flight attendant. The FBI could not risk giving him a faulty chute if an innocent civilian might be strapped into it. Before we move to the landing in Seattle, I have a question for you. If you were the negotiator on the ground, would you have risked giving him a dummy chute knowing he might take a hostage, or would you have complied exactly as they did? Let me know your take in the comments. The pilot, William Scott, contacted air traffic control, who then contacted the local police and the FBI. The president of Northwest Orient Airlines, Donald Nyrop, made the decision to authorize the payment. He feared bad publicity and the loss of life more than the loss of money. For the next 2 hours, Flight 305 circled Puget Sound. The pilot told the passengers that there was a minor mechanical difficulty and they needed to burn off fuel before landing. Most of the 36 passengers had no idea they were being hijacked. Cooper sat in the back, wearing dark sunglasses, sipping a second bourbon. He even offered to pay for his drinks. When Schaffner told him to keep the change, he insisted she take it. This wasn't the behavior of a desperate junkie or a political radical. This was a professional who was completely at ease with high-stakes pressure. On the ground in Seattle, the FBI scrambled. They obtained the money from several area banks. It was $10,020 bills. This is a crucial detail. The FBI photographed every single one of those bills on microfilm. They had a record of every serial number. This created a fingerprint for the cash that would last forever. The parachutes were harder to find. They eventually sourced them from a local skydiving school. One of the reserve chutes they were given was actually a dummy, used for classroom demonstrations. It was sewn shut. We don't know if this was intentional or a mistake in the rush, but Cooper would eventually discover this. At 5:39 p.m., the plane landed at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Cooper ordered the pilot to taxi to a remote, well-lit section of the tarmac. He demanded that the cabin lights be dimmed to prevent snipers from seeing inside. This again suggests a tactical mind. A fuel truck approached. Cooper's instructions were precise. The money and parachutes were to be delivered, and then the passengers would be released. He held true to his word. Once the ransom was on board, he allowed all 36 passengers and Florence Schaffner to leave the aircraft. He kept 4 crew members: pilot William Scott, First Officer Bob Radizak, Flight Engineer H.E. Anderson, and Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow. While the plane was being refueled, a process that was delayed due to a vapor lock in the fuel truck, which noticeably agitated Cooper for the first time, he outlined his flight plan. He wanted to be flown to Mexico City, but the pilots explained that a fully loaded 727 could not fly that far without refueling. They agreed to fly to Reno, Nevada, as a fuel stop. But then Cooper gave the flight configuration commands that have puzzled aviators and investigators for decades. He ordered them to fly at no more than 10,000 feet altitude. He ordered the landing gear to remain down and locked. He ordered the wing flaps set to 15 degrees. And most importantly, he ordered that the cabin remain unpressurized. Why these settings? A Boeing 727 is unique because it has a ventral air stair, a set of stairs in the rear tail that lowers downward. If the cabin is pressurized, the pressure differential makes it physically impossible to open that door in flight. By keeping the cabin unpressurized and flying slow with the gear down to add drag, Cooper was creating the only aerodynamic environment in which he could open that door and jump without being instantly killed by the slipstream. He knew exactly how this specific airplane worked. This knowledge has led many to believe he was an aircraft mechanic, a pilot, or a paratrooper. As they prepared for takeoff from Seattle, the FAA approached the plane to warn the crew that taking off with the stairs down was unsafe. Cooper, sensing a stall tactic, grabbed the intercom and snapped, "Everything is ready. Let's get this show on the road." He ordered the crew into the cockpit and told them to close the door. There was no peephole in the door. From that moment on, Dan Cooper was the only person in the passenger cabin. The plane took off at 7:40 p.m. It was followed by 2 F-106 fighter jets scrambled from a nearby airbase, intended to track the airliner. However, because Cooper had ordered the plane to fly so slowly, about 100 knots, the jets couldn't maintain that speed without stalling. They had to weave back and forth, S-turning behind the 727. Coupled with the severe storm and zero visibility, the fighter pilots essentially lost visual contact with the airliner almost immediately. Cooper had used the weather and the aircraft's performance limits to blind his pursuers. Inside the cabin, Cooper went to work. He cut the cords off one of the parachutes to use as tie-downs for the money bag. Remember the dummy reserve chute? Cooper apparently realized it was non-functional, because he cut it open and left it on the plane. He strapped on the military-grade backpack chute and the functional chest reserve. He secured the bank bag to his waist. Then, he moved to the rear door. In the cockpit, a warning light flashed indicating the aft air stair was being deployed. The pilots felt the change in air pressure. At approximately 8 p.m., the flight engineer got on the intercom and asked Cooper, "Is there anything we can do for you?" Cooper replied with a single word. "No." It was the last word he ever spoke to anyone. At 8:13 p.m., the plane was flying over the Lewis River area in southwest Washington. The crew felt a significant upward motion, the pressure bump. This was the recoil of the aircraft as a 200-pound weight suddenly left the rear stairs. Cooper was gone. He jumped into a freezing rainstorm at night over a dense forest of Douglas firs, wearing loafers and a trench coat. He had no helmet, no goggles, and the parachute he chose, the NB-8 rig, was not steerable. He was at the mercy of the wind. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the mechanics of the heist, please verify that you are subscribed to the channel. We cover complex cold cases like this every week, and you won't want to miss the upcoming episode on the Alcatraz escape. The investigation that launched the next morning, codenamed Norjack, Northwest Hijacking, was one of the most extensive in FBI history. Agents walked grid patterns through the wilderness. They used State Route 71 Blackbird spy planes to refly the path and photograph the ground. Submarines even searched Lake Merwin, a deep reservoir in the flight path, thinking he might have plunged into the water. They found nothing. Not the parachute, not the briefcase, not the money. It wasn't just the physical search that was difficult. The information hygiene was messy. Early on, police questioned a local Oregon man named D.B. Cooper for a minor unrelated offense. A wire reporter, rushing to meet a deadline, confused the suspect's name with the hijacker's alias Dan Cooper. The headline went out as D.B. Cooper, and despite the FBI's corrections, the name stuck. The legend of D.B. Cooper was born from a clerical error. For 9 years, the case was completely cold. Dead cold. Then in 1980, a miracle happened. 8-year-old Brian Ingram was vacationing with his family at a spot called Tina Bar on the Columbia River, about 20 miles downstream from Vancouver, Washington. He was digging a fire pit in the sand when he found 3 rotting bundles of cash. The bills were $20 notes. The edges were rounded and decomposed. The rubber bands were still intact. The FBI confirmed the serial numbers match. This discovery is the single most baffling piece of evidence in the entire case. The money was found upstream from where most calculations suggested Cooper would have landed. Geologists and hydrologists have fought for decades over how it got there. Some believe the money floated down from a tributary. Others believe it was buried there by hand. But the diatoms, microscopic algae, found on the bills suggested the money had been wet specifically during the spring season, not the winter. This led to the washdown theory, suggesting the money stayed somewhere else for months before washing into the river. But here is where the organic CTA comes in. I really want your opinion on this specific detail. If Cooper died on impact in the woods, how did the money bag separate from him, travel miles into a river, and get buried in the sand at Tina Bar? Or, did he survive, bury some of the money to come back for later, and never return? Leave your theory in the comments, dead on arrival, or buried for later. Let's look at the suspects. Over 1,000 people were considered suspects. But only a few remain compelling today. First, there is Richard McCoy. 5 months after Cooper's jump, McCoy hijacked a United Airlines flight out of Denver. He used a hand grenade, demanded $500,000, and jumped from the rear stairs of a 727. It was almost a carbon copy of the Cooper heist. McCoy was an experienced skydiver and a Green Beret helicopter pilot. He was caught after the second heist, convicted, and later killed in a shootout after breaking out of prison. He physically resembled the sketch. His family even claimed he had spoken about the Cooper job. But the FBI ruled him out because he supposedly had an alibi for Thanksgiving 1971. He was at home in Utah having dinner. However, alibis from family members are notoriously unreliable. The McCoy is Cooper theory rests on the idea that lightning doesn't strike twice, that 2 men wouldn't independently invent the exact same complex crime on the exact same aircraft type within 5 months. Then there is Robert Rackstraw. Rackstraw was a former Army helicopter pilot with a history of legal trouble and a skill set that matched Cooper perfectly. He knew parachuting, he knew explosives, and he knew the Pacific Northwest. In the late 70s, He even tried to hint to the media that he might be Cooper, likely to gain attention. Investigators looked at him hard, but his DNA didn't match the partial samples recovered from the tie, though the validity of those samples is debated, and he was eventually dismissed as a wannabe rather than the real deal. Rackstraw passed away in 2019, denying he was Cooper to the end. And we have to talk about Sheridan Peterson. Peterson was a smoke jumper, a firefighter who parachutes into forest fires. He worked for Boeing. He lived in the Pacific Northwest. Even photos from the era show him in a suit looking eerily like the police sketch. He had the technical knowledge to know about the 727's air stare. When asked by the FBI if he was Cooper, he reportedly replied, "I'm not, but the FBI has good reason to suspect me." However, the most groundbreaking development came not from the FBI, but from a group of citizen sleuths who were granted access to the tie Cooper left behind. In 2011, a team of scientists used electron microscopy to analyze the dust particles embedded in the fabric of the cheap JCPenney clip-on tie. They found specific alloys: titanium, cerium, strontium sulfide, and yttrium. This is a massive clue. In 1971, titanium was a strategic metal. It was not used in golf clubs or consumer goods. It was used almost exclusively in high-end military aerospace projects or chemical plants. The presence of these particles suggests Cooper wasn't just a random drifter. He was likely a manager or engineer who walked the floor of a facility working with these exotic materials. This points the finger directly at employees of Boeing, who were building the supersonic transport project at the time, or Tektronix. It shifts the profile from rogue commando to disgruntled aerospace engineer. The specific combination of particles found on the tie was actually rare enough that it narrowed the pool of potential workplaces to fewer than 10 facilities in the entire Pacific Northwest. This is verified science, yet because employee records from 1971 are incomplete or lost, we can't simply cross-reference the list. We have the where, but we still don't have the who. In July 2016, the FBI officially announced they were redirecting resources away from the D.B. Cooper case. They stated that unless specific physical evidence, like the parachute or the remaining money, was found, they would not continue the active hunt. The case is functionally closed, but officially unsolved. There is a psychological aspect to this that keeps us coming back. Cooper was polite. He didn't hurt anyone. He ordered drinks, tipped the staff, and disappeared into the night. In an era of violent political terrorism, Cooper felt different, almost like a folk hero. He robbed a faceless corporation, embarrassed the government, and vanished. We want him to have survived. We want to believe that someone can beat the system that thoroughly. But we must return to the physics. He jumped into a -7-degree wind chill at 170 miles per hour. He was wearing a trench coat and loafers. The parachute he used, the NB-8, was a bailout rig intended for emergency pilots, not for precision skydiving. It cannot be steered. If he landed in the trees, the canopy would likely snag, leaving him dangling 50 feet in the air in a freezing storm. If he landed in Lake Merwin, the weight of the money and the wet gear would have dragged him down in seconds. The most likely reality is that Dan Cooper died that night, and his body was reclaimed by the wilderness, scattered by scavengers and time. The money found at Tina Bar was likely dragged there by animals, or washed down from a corpse entangled in root systems upstream. Yet, without a body, the door remains open. Maybe he lost the money during the opening shock of the parachute. Maybe he landed, broke a leg, and crawled to a road. Maybe he walked into a bank in Mexico City a week later. The serial numbers are still out there, public record, waiting for a match. If you're still watching, here is my final question for you, and I want you to be specific. Do you think the titanium evidence proves he was an aerospace insider, or is it just a coincidence from a thrift store tie? Tell me insider or coincidence in the comments. As we close the file on D.B. Cooper today, remember that the Pacific Northwest is vast, dense, and unforgiving. Somewhere out there might still be a rotting parachute harness or a rusty buckle waiting to be stumbled upon by a hiker. Until then, Dan Cooper remains the ghost of the skies. If you enjoyed this detailed investigation, you should definitely watch our video on the Istal woman, another mystery involving a disguised identity, strange clues, and a body that police couldn't identify. Click the video on your screen now to continue the investigation. I'll see you there.